As you develop your final extended analysis for the course, I wanted to offer some direction in terms of how to think about editing, revision, and proofreading for that work. And to open with that discussion, I want to be clear in distinguishing the goals of editing here. So editing is kind of a broad word for the task that's at hand for you. Editing, but also editing includes the deciding on the piece that you'd like to revise or build upon. So if you want to consult with me and to kind of think about which piece works the best there, that would be perfectly fine. Revision refers mainly to working at the larger organizational level of your analysis. So there you're thinking about the craft and organization of the argument that you're trying to develop around a literary work. It also involves expanding the work in some ways, perhaps, and developing clear points of support or complication for your argument. So this would be about developing examples from the text itself, and or developing perhaps other ways of reading a particular moment or interpreting another moment within the story. Proofreading in distinction is working at the sentence level. So there you want to go, read through the text carefully, looking for errors in grammar, spelling, punctuation, etc. Also thinking about editing for clarity and focus at the sentence level, as well as word choice within the sentence. I would also throw in paragraphing here as an important part of revision as well, to think about how you utilize paragraphing to set up and clarify your argument. Also here, think about the conventions in writing literary analysis. In particular, if you introduce a textual example, be sure to give some context for the moment within the story, or how the example fits within an author's wider work. So don't just drop examples in without producing a little bit of context for what's happening in the story or within the novel when this moment occurs. Be clear about the story's details here. Be sure you review names of characters, sequences of events, all those things. You want your reader to be able to get a clear sense of how you read and interpret a particular story. And if those details aren't entirely clear, the analysis won't be clear. When you write about the author of the story, write about it in present tense and use the author's last name when you build a reference within the story. So if you're writing about one of Jesmond Ward's works, you would write the sentence that Ward writes that surviving Katrina was ... So use present tense and the author's last name to introduce some thought that the author makes. And then if you include outside sources, or when you quote text from the stories themselves, include those citations in MLA format. There are examples of this online from the Purdue Online Writing Lab, but the simplest way is an example right here. If you were quoting from Richard Powers' story, you would simply introduce a moment like, Helen asks, "Why do humans write so much?" And then the page number in parentheses, no P or anything like that, or within it just the numerals themselves, followed by the closing punctuation mark for the sentence. I would think about, if you think about this analysis at the paragraph level, there are three kind of basic impulses that you work with within a given paragraph within literary analysis. One is for defining the argument, one is for supporting the argument, and one is for complicating the argument. When you are editing for defining the argument here, a couple of points. First, push the definition of your thesis or central claim. Your basic argument should be clear in that first paragraph of the analysis itself. Ask yourself whether that central claim is argumentative, that is there another side or another interpretation or another reading that could be done versus yours? Is it clear, and is it complex enough to support a extended analysis? What you're doing here is that you're arguing for an interpretation of the work or story, and so what is the importance of this work, or what is the significance of your understanding of the story or work or the character? That's what you're basically arguing in the analysis. As you develop those paragraphs beyond, think carefully about each paragraph's purpose within the larger argument. You want to avoid simply summarizing your source text or retelling the story. Maybe one paragraph within your project could summarize the story or the passages of the novel. You don't want to get caught up in trying to summarize the whole novel. Assume that the reader is familiar with the story or the novel, and that you are simply giving the reader another way of understanding or interpreting the story or novel. Develop clear supporting paragraphs that fit with your argument or appropriate to your argument, and then also think about the presence of counter-argument or complication within your writing. Introduce a little of that as well. As you define the argument, try to move beyond that simple 5-paragraph theme, right? An introductory paragraph, 3 paragraphs of support, and then a concluding paragraph. One way I always think about it is, you can sandwich support and complication. So you could build a point of support and then kind of complicate that support, or offer another way of interpreting a piece from the story. That makes for a nice kind of more complicated argument in interpretation. In terms of developing paragraphs that build support for your argument, use clear examples from the text versus simply referring to the text. So quote the text or paraphrase specific moments of distinct or important conflict or definition within your story or novel. So don't just refer to the character and say it was kind of like when, working directly with the text itself and building support for your analysis. Secondly, reinforce examples when you build points of comparison or contrast. Clarify the point of connection. So here, if you wanted to take, an example from one of the novels and compare it to a moment in a short story, make it clear what that point of connection is. Whether it's a point of comparison or whether it's a point of contrast there between characters or moments or plot. I'm asking you to just do interpretation with this paper, but if you want to include outside research, you're certainly welcome to do that. You can use the basic databases that are available through our library. If you do use outside research, though, I'd like for you to introduce the source data and include citations for the outside sources that you're using. Avoid plagiarism, at all costs here, and be sure to include a works cited page with your paper as well. And then finally, in developing complication within your argument, a lot of times you get introduced to this idea through the idea of counter-argument, right? That counter-argument offers another way of reading or interpreting a story. So you can include moments of counter-argument as complications within your argument. You include counter-argument as a means of building up your own argument, as a way of helping the reader understand that you have also considered other interpretations as well here. But you can also think about complication in another way, which is just how you explore the work or text in various other ways as well. So you could complicate a work's sense of historical or artistic context. So if you wanted to compare Galatea 2.2 to another writer's work about technology, that would be very interesting, or to a visual artist's work on technology, or a musical artist singing about technology might be interesting as well. You could explore psychological aspects of the story or character's world here. In what ways does your training or introduction to psychology, help you to read the character and how the character thinks and puts the world together through the story? If there are points of confusion with the story that you have when you actually read it, how do those come into an interpretation of the story as well. If there's something that's confusing, maybe it's worth exploring within your analysis. You can imagine a point within the story that's told from another point of view. So if you reimagine Galatea 2.2 as being narrated by Lentz or being narrated by Helen itself, then that might be an interesting way to think about how Rick's point of view works within Power's storytelling there. And also you can think about the wider implications here. So what are the implications from the story for the larger context of writing and storytelling? And here we've thought about the idea of fairy tale and myth and how writers have engaged those basic forms of storytelling in contemporary work. And so how do the stories that you've read in the class perhaps have implications beyond their historical moment of storytelling? How do they connect back to myth or fairy tale from here? I look forward to reading your work, and if you have questions, please let me know. Thanks.